This section is going to cover phase shift of sinusoidal functions. Don't expect me to say it right again. So this is going to be our last. So we talked about horizontal shift a little bit in our previous graphing section, and you also have learned about horizontal shift back in Math 111. But let's talk about it a little bit more here because there's another word that comes in for sinusoidal functions, which are cosine and cosine, and that is called phase shift. Phase shift doesn't necessarily help us that much when it comes to graphing, but it is a term that you do need to know for engineering and physics, which is why we introduce it in here. So you've got this graph here. We're just going to focus on this one. So we would not say that the horizontal shift is pi over 2, and that's because we don't have that value isolated. So the way you figure out the difference is if I go through and I factor that 2 out. So when you factor a value out, if I'm factoring the 2 out, I divide everything by 2. So 2 divided by 2 gives me that 1x, and then pi over 2 divided by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2, so that gives me pi over 4. So again, if I went through and actually distributed this 2 through, you'd get 2x and then minus pi over 2. So when you have a graph like this where it's not factored, this value here is not the horizontal shift, we call it the phase shift. Once you factor it, then that value there is called the horizontal shift. So for example, if we were looking at this one and we had to find the phase shift and horizontal shift, so we can tell right off the bat that phase shift, and it's always the opposite, so it's always minus and then whatever that number is the phase shift and horizontal shift. So here we'd say the phase shift is 2 pi over 3. And then if we have to talk about the horizontal shift, so now what we have to do is we have to factor this. I'm going to factor that 2 out. When I do that again, you divide everything by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is just that 1. And then 2 pi over 3 divided by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2, which gives me pi over 3. So we'd say that the phase shift is 2 pi over 3, and that horizontal shift is pi over 3. And to be even more precise, we would say it's pi over 3 units to the right. So whenever it's the minus, we go to the right. If ever this is a plus, we go to the left. So now what we can do is we can take all of the things that we learned about graphing in the previous section on graphing sine and cosine functions, and in there we didn't deal with any functions that had a horizontal shift. So we're going to take all those things that we learned about amplitude, period, midline, where to draw your tick marks, and now we're going to add in a horizontal shift. So you start this the same way when you go to graph this. So when I go to graph it, we write amplitude, we need to know the period, we need to know the midline, horizontal shift, and then the tick marks. So all of these things we still have to find in order to graph these. The horizontal shift is just going to add one little different change when we're doing these. Okay, so first things first, we can see that our phase shift would be negative pi over 2, because remember it's always the opposite. So if this is a positive, this would be a negative pi over 2. But the phase shift is not our horizontal shift. So let's factor this out. So this is going to be the sine of pi times x. So I'm taking a pi out. So take pi over 2, divide it by pi, and you're going to be left with 1/2. And then plus 3. Okay, so this means we're going to have, so let's find, so our amplitudes, you can see here our amplitude is just 1. Our period is 2 pi divided by b, so the b value is just pi. So 2 pi divided by pi, so our period is 2. The midline is what we're adding here, so that's y equals 3. Our horizontal shift is going to be 1/2, and we're going to go to the left. And then our tick marks, again, are you take that period, divide it by 4, so you get that the tick marks are going to be 1/2. So when I go to graph this, so now, because of this horizontal shift, that's where my first tick mark is going to be. So I'm 1/2 to the left. So normally I would start here at 0. I need to go 1/2 in the left, so in the negative direction. So that's where I'm going to start now. And each tick mark is going to be 1/2. So we've got first tick mark, second, third, fourth, fifth. So each of these is adding 1/2 to it. So -1/2 plus 1/2 is 0, plus another 1/2 is 1/2. 1/2 plus 1/2 is 1. And then 1 plus 1/2 is 1.5. And if we needed to do 2 periods of this, you could just keep this going. So we would need to have 5 more tick marks. So 1, that's where it starts, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'd be at 2, 2.5, oops, 3, and then 3.5. Okay, so we've got our midline is at 3. So 1, 2, 3. So there's our midline. Our amplitude is 1, so at 4 is going to be my maximum, and then at 3 is going to be my minimum. Okay, so let's do our first cycle of this. So to do our first cycle, again, we're going to start at 1/2 to the left, because this graph, instead of starting at 0, we're shifting it 1/2 to the left. So we start at the midline, we end at the midline, so 1 full cycle is 2, so we're ending at 1.5. In between those, you're at the midline. Between those two, you're at the max. And then those two, you're at the min. So there's our first cycle. So then to do the next one, okay, start here, end at the midline. In between there, we're at the midline. In between those two, we're at the max. Those two, we're at the min. And there we go. Okay, so now if we have this, and again, same kind of deal. So we're going to write out the amplitude, the period, the midline, the horizontal shift, and the tick marks. Okay, so let's first go through and factor that 4 out. So when I take the 4 out, that's just left with a t, and that becomes a plus pi over 4. Okay, so our amplitude is going to be the absolute value of 2, which is 2. Our period is 2 pi divided by b, and the b value here is 4. So it's going to be pi over 2 is our period. Our midline is at y equals 1. Our horizontal shift is going to be pi over 4 to the left, because it's going to go in the negative direction because it's always the opposite. And then our tick marks are going to be our period divided by 4, so that gives us pi over 8. Okay. Alrighty. So we know that we're going to need to start at -1/4, because we're shifting it 1/4 to, or pi over 4, because we're shifting it to the left there. And I know that each tick mark is going to be pi over 8. So if I were doing pi over 8, sometimes it's easier just to write these as with that common denominator. So -pi over 4 is the same thing as -2 pi over 8. So if I go add a pi over 8 to that, -2 pi over 8 plus pi over 8 leaves me with -pi over 8. Add a pi over 8 to that, and I'm at 0. Add a pi over 8 to that, and I'm at pi over 8. And then add a pi over 8 to that, and I'm at pi over 8. Plus another pi over 8 leaves me with 2 pi over 8, which reduces to pi over 4. Okay, so there's one full cycle. I'll start there, and then we can do the other period. All right, so we've got our midline is at 1. Our amplitude is 2, so that means I'm going to go up to 3 and down to -1. And I like to, again, draw those little things just because it helps me. Okay, so when I go to graph this, this is going to be the sine function, and we're not having any reflections because that's positive. So for the sine function, and we start here, pi over 4 to the left, which is right here. Okay, so we've got first one, start at the midline, end at the midline, halfway in between you're at the midline again, halfway in between those you're at the max, halfway between those you're at the min. So there's one period. And then if I were going to do another period of this, okay, start at pi over 4, add pi over 8 to it, so pi over 4 plus pi over 8, common denominator would be 8, so multiply this by 2 over 2, so that'll give me 3 pi over 8. Add another pi over 8, and I'm at 4 pi over 8, which reduces to pi over 2. Take 4 pi over 8, add another pi over 8, and I'm at 5 pi over 8. 5 pi over 8 plus another pi over 8 is 6 pi over 8, which reduces to 3 pi over 4. And now I've got my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tick marks. So you always start your second cycle. The first tick mark is where the first cycle ended. Okay, so again, start at the midline, end at the midline. In between that, we're at the midline. In between those two, we're at the max. In between those two, we're at the min. There you go. Okay, so let's just keep on going. So graph two periods of f of x equals -2 cosine of 2x minus pi over 2 plus 1. So what I would recommend doing right now, if you can, is I would actually just pause the video and see if you can do this on your own, and then come back and you can watch how I filled it out. All right, so again, we're going to write our amplitude, period, midline, horizontal shift, and then our tick marks. Okay, I'm going to rewrite that inside. So that becomes, when I factor out a 2, divide that by 2, and I'm just left with x. When I divide this by 2, I'm left with pi over 4. Okay, so my amplitude is the absolute value of -2, which is 2. Our period is 2 pi over b, and our b value is 2, so 2 pi over 2, which is pi. Our midline is at y equals 1. Our horizontal shift is pi over 4 to the right, because again, it's always that opposite. And then our tick marks are going to be our period divided by 4. Okay. All right, so this means I'm going to start at pi over 4 to the right. So there's my first tick mark. Okay, so I'm going to add pi over 4 each time. So pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 2 pi over 4, which reduces to pi over 2. 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 4 pi over 4, which is pi. And then 4 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 5 pi over 4. So again, I had to do this extra one because we're starting here, and again, I needed to have those 5 tick marks. Okay, midline is at y equals 1. And then our amplitude is 2. So our maximum is going to be at 3. Our minimum is going to be at -1. Okay, so now we've got those things set, and this is the cosine graph. So normally with the cosine graph, you'd start at the maximum, end at the maximum, in the middle you're at the middle, in the middle of those you're at that midline. But because this has this negative, that means I'm going to reflect over that x-axis. So the minimums become the maximum, or the maximums become the minimums, and the minimums become the maximum. So it's going to look like this instead. All right, here we go. So I'm starting at pi over 4. Okay, so this is my first tick mark because I had to shift my graph over. So I'm going to start at the minimum because again, this is reflected. So that means I end at the minimum. Halfway in between that, I'm at the maximum. Halfway in between there, I'm at the midline. Halfway in between there, I'm at the midline. And then you can continue going if you wanted to have 2 periods by continuing to add pi over 4 each time to get more tick marks. And then you can continue this on in the same pattern. Okay, so now let's kind of do the opposite. Here we've already been given the graph, so now we have to come up with the formulas for it. A lot of times in math, you're going to see where they call it algebraic rules. So whenever you see that, that just means find the formula for the function graph below. So we're going to do one for sine and one for cosine. Luckily, with both the sine and the cosine, we know that they're just shifts of each other horizontally. So they're going to have the same period, the same amplitude, and the same midline. So let's first find the period, amplitude, and midline of this graph, and then we'll separate out the cosine and the sine. So remember that the period here, we can see if we start here at the x-axis or the y-axis, it's going to do one full cycle and end right here, which is at pi. So our period is pi. So to figure out that b value for our graphs, remember we've got y equals a times the sine of b times x minus h plus k, or cosine of all that. So to find that b value, we know that the period equals 2 pi over b. Multiply both sides by b, and we get b pi equals 2 pi. Divide both sides by pi to get the b by itself, and you get that b is 2. So we know that part. So now for the midline, we can see that the midline right in the middle is right here. So that's at y equals -2. So that means that our k value is -2. And then for our amplitude, so the distance between the midline and the maximum and the midline and the minimum is 4 units. So our amplitude is going to be 4. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start with finding the formula for the cosine graph. And that's because if I just started at here, that means I don't have to deal with any horizontal shifting. The only thing that we will have to take note of is that instead of this cosine graph starting at the maximum, it's reversed. So it starts at the minimum. So that means that we've reflected it. So when we do that reflection, we put that negative in front. So -a, so my amplitude is 4, times the cosine of b, so my b value is 2. I don't have any h, so it's just going to be 2x, and then plus k, which is -2. So there's the cosine function. So now if I were writing this as a sine function, so that's going to be y equals, so I'm going to choose to do, I'm going to do this in red, this part. So here's the sine function I'm going to model. So this function is going to have all of these same amplitude, k or b value, except it's going to be shifted to the right pi over 4, which means that this h value is going to end up being, it's going to be x plus pi over 4. Okay, my amplitude, so this a value is actually going to be positive because I'm not dealing with reflecting this, and this is what the normal sine function looks like. So in this case, the a value is positive. My b value is the same thing, so 2, but now I'm going to have the x here, and then we're moving pi over 4 units to the right, so that's going to be minus pi over 4. It's always the opposite. And then again, that midline is -2. Okay, now that we've gotten the hang of graphing, let's actually put this into some real life examples. And sine and cosine graphs are actually used in the real world all the time. They model frequency of sound, so they're used in music all the time. They're used in the way that the waves move in the ocean. There's tons of different things that the sine and cosine functions model in the real world, which is why we learn about them. So if we have an example here where a company sells QM 1,000 blankets in a month M, with M equals 0 being January 1st, and Q of M equals, and there's the formula, If we had to graph this over 1 year, so we're going to do all of the same things we've already learned. So our amplitude is 30. Our period is 2 pi over b. So the first thing I'm going to actually need to do is factor this thing out. So this is going to give me 30 times the sign of, I'm going to pull that pi over 6 out in front. So when I divide that by pi over 6, I'm left with an m. And then if I divide pi over 2 by pi over 6, dividing by pi over 6 is the same thing as multiplying by 6 over pi. So that's going to leave me with 3. And then plus 70. So this is going to help out a lot for all these things. Okay, so we've got period is 2 pi divided by b, so it's going to be 2 pi divided by pi over 6. So 2 pi times 6 over pi, which gives me 12, which makes sense in the way because, again, these x units are in terms of months, so that would mean the period is 12 months, so it follows 1 full year of the blankets that are being sold. So the midline is 70. And then we've got the, what else do we need to know? We need to know a horizontal shift. So that's going to be 3 units to the left. And then for our tick marks, that's going to be the period divided by 4, so that's going to be 3. All right, here we go. So we've got to shift 3 to the left. All right, so there's -3. There's our first tick mark. Tick mark units are 3, so -3 plus 3 is 0. There's our next one. Add another 3, we're at 3. Add another 3, I'm at 6. And then add another 3, I'm at 9. So there's where your tick marks are going to be. I probably shouldn't have that big bolded there, but okay, our midline is 70, so I'm going to make these, let's make these by 20. So 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120. So we've got a midline at 70. And then our maximum is going to be 30 above that. So 70 plus 30 puts me at 100. And then 30 below that, 70 minus 30 puts me at 40. Okay, so this is a sine graph. So that means I'm going to start at the midline. So again, I start at -3. I'm going to end at the midline. Halfway in between, I'm at the midline. Halfway in between those, I'm at their maximum at 100. And then now I'm at the minimum down there. So let's look at this graph and kind of interpret it in the context of this formula or problem. So we know that these are months. So month 0 is January, so that would be February, March, here's April, May, June, here's July, August, September, I cannot do months, August, September, October, November. Am I screwing this up big time? Okay. May, oh my goodness. Okay, so this would be January, February, yeah, March, April, May, June, July. Yeah, so this is, and then July, August, sorry, bear with me guys, August, September, October. There we go. Okay. So if we were looking at this graph and kind of interpreting it, does this make sense? So this Y value is the number of blankets that are being sold. So does it make sense that more blankets, the maximum value of the number of blankets that are getting sold happens in January? And in my opinion, yes. And that's because you're obviously going to be colder, so more blankets are going to sell. And look at this minimum value. That minimum value happens in July, which also makes sense because that's usually the warmest time of the year. And then it starts to increase as we're getting closer to winter.